Dr. Allan Cougle practiced general pediatrics for 7 years in New Orleans, and later in his career as a doctor, he was assistant professor of pediatric cardiology at Southern Illinois University School of Medicine. Dr. Cougle certainly has the credentials to talk about medicine in the Bible, both the Old and New Testament. You've been a physician for more than 50 years. Wow. That's a career to talk about.
Yeah, more than 40 years.
More
actually.
than 40 years.
Yeah.
Okay, I stand corrected. But you do know about medicine, and as a Christian, medicine in the Bible. What started this whole conversation about Rapha? What is Rapha, and why did you write about it?
Well, when I was an assistant professor at one of the medical centers in Illinois, I was writing. The thing is, the publish or perish, and so one of the things I wrote about was the medicine in the Bible. Rapha is from the Hebrew word for physician. Rapha is the feminine form of that, and of course we're familiar with the names of God, Jehovah Rapha or Jehovah Rapha. The word physician is only used 4 times in the Old Testament. Once when Joseph called the physicians for his father to embalm him, and these were probably more embalmers than physicians. King Asa went to physicians instead of to God and died. Jeremiah said, "Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there?" And of course, Job said about his comforters that there were physicians of no consequence. Rapha itself, the word is probably what's called an onomatopoeia, which means it's a word that sounds like what it is, just like buzz or tinkle or murmur. These are words that sound like what they are, and it comes from the seizing and plucking is the derivation, much like when somebody mends or sews. So to mend is where the word Rapha comes from. And actually, physicians were not held in high regard in ancient Hebrew society because they were thought to actually go against the will of God. Because all disease was thought to be the will of God, then physicians, in trying to go against that, are going against God's will. In fact, in the Talmud, it talks about that even the best of physicians was destined to go to hell. Of course, now the big thing among Jewish society is they want their son to become a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. So things have changed.
Yeah, physicians then were what lawyers are now, apparently. Yeah. But how did things change between the Old Testament and the New Testament? Because when I think of physicians and the Bible, immediately I think of Luke, who was a physician who wrote the Gospel. How did things change between those 2 testaments?
That's interesting. The Deuteronomic theology, which is from the book of Deuteronomy, says that all disease is a result of disobedience towards God. But then you go into the New Testament, you look at John 9, and it says, the disciples asked Jesus, who sinned? This man that was born blind. Was it his sin or his parents' sin? And Jesus said it wasn't sin at all. He said it was so the glory of God might be manifest. And he said those that are whole don't need a physician, but those that are sick need a physician. And Jesus, even in healing, in the act of healing, would use physical, like mud or saliva, or putting his finger in somebody's ear, or touching the eye specifically. So Jesus was not against people going to physicians.
What about the woman with the issue of blood? I've heard that sermon many times. In your practice and what you know about medicine after 40 years, what disease did she have?
Well, it's not known for sure, she had some type of issue that whether it was an infection or whether it was a cancer or something like that was producing an issue that was prolonged for many years. And of course, she came to Jesus, and by touching him, her touching him, actually, she received healing in that. But
Doctor, what do you say to people who say, you know, I'm a Christian and I believe in divine healing, and so I should not go to go to see my doctor? People have died because of that, because of their beliefs. What do you say to that?
Well, it's like King Asa. You know, it's fine to go to a physician, and I think, obviously, you know, I think you should go to a physician, but I think that you should do it with prayer and believing that God is the author of all healing, whether it's supernaturally or naturally. God put in each one of us the antibodies and the healing processes and everything else that to bring about healing of most diseases. And then there are certain diseases that require the help of a physician, specifically, you know, things like surgery. If you break a bone or if you need some type of a surgical procedure, obviously, then you should go to a physician. But not without praying first, during, and afterwards.
Another one of the diseases that I've always wondered about in the Bible is leprosy, because I think it's referred to differently in there than what we understand it as today, isn't it?
Yeah. The term leprosy in the Bible was tsarath, and the Septuagint, which was written about 250 BC, was commissioned by Ptolemy II. And there were 70 Hebrew scholars that for 70 days translated the Hebrew into the Greek. And they came across the word tsarath, and there was no exact correlate for that. So they borrowed from Hippocrates the word lepra, and that's where the word leprosy comes from. Leprosy then, or what was referred to leprosy, is probably much different than what we call Hansen's disease, which is the leprosy of today. The Hansen's disease is characterized by anesthesia in the involved part of the body, so that you don't feel things and consequently you injure them, and there's mutilation, that you can lose fingers or whatever. There isn't always the color change that is described in the Bible. Of course, leprosy in the Bible talked about leprosy of inanimate things also, such as houses and clothing and so forth. So the leprosy that we read in the Bible is not exactly the same thing as what we call leprosy today. And though the leprosy in the New Testament may be more of what we're more familiar with, the cleansing, when it said you must be cleansed from leprosy but healed of diseases. So there was a difference there. I think that speaks of judgment, that many times leprosy was a punishment from God, like for Uzziah or Miriam or others that were afflicted with leprosy.
You also talk about demonic possession and, you know, modern day insanity, people who go insane. Talk about those two, and there's such division in the church about mental illness and how it should be treated. Should people just go and get in a prayer line, or should they receive medication?
Yes.
Okay, so that's the answer to the question. Okay.
There's a gray zone. And you look at the Old Testament, you look at David feigning madness so that he could get out of a tough situation. Saul, when the Spirit of God was taken from him, became a manic depressive with persecution complex. And Nebuchadnezzar, you know, he for several years became like a beast in the field. You know, he was insane. But then in the time of Jesus, you see there's a real outpouring. You know, I think it's almost a mimicking. Here you have God in the flesh in Jesus, so Satan counterfeits it by producing demons in the flesh. And I think there was much more obvious demonic activity at that time, but it's still today. You see in terrorism and senseless acts of violence, and you see many times demon possession today.
Well, this is a really interesting read. It's called Raphae, A Study of Medicine in the Bible. To connect with Dr. Cougle, check him out on Facebook at Raphae Medicine, or go to harvest-tv.com for a link to his new project. Coming up later, your prayer request, but up next, Brian Bush with today's Holy Land Moment. We'll be right back. Okay.